Senator Clinton has confirmed that she will try to get delegates pledged to her as a result of the decertified Michigan and Florida Democratic primaries certified. You know why that's happening now? Because earlier, none of the candidates really thought it would come down to delegates, not to delegates rather, but to primary victories. But now in our fourth story in the countdown, the math has been done. Super duper tsunami Tuesday will not and cannot decide the nomination of either party. The 22 states holding elections on Super Tuesday, bringing a combined total of 1,681 delegates plus a further 386 super delegates. Super delegates, you know, the thing everybody understands, but nobody can define in 12 words or less extemporaneously. There are 797 of them up for grabs across the country, discounting Michigan and Florida, who had their delegates stripped by the party, except Senator Clinton wants them back now. None of them are picked by primaries. None of them have to support the same candidate as their state. None of them have to keep their promises to a candidate until they actually vote at the convention. Right now, Senator Obama is actually in the lead with elected delegates, 38 to Senator Clinton's 36. But when you factor in the superdelegates who have already publicly been pledged to a candidate, depending on which news organization is doing the asking, Clinton has 236 or 218 or 210. Obama trails with 136, 127, 154. Joined now by our own David Schuster, who's in Columbia, South Carolina, ahead of tomorrow's primary. David, thanks. Good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
So if there are 797 superdelegates, candidate needs 2,025 votes to win at a convention. That means 39% of the delegates that the candidate would need to win could not be chosen at the voting booth, could instead be these superdelegates. Given how tight the race for the voted delegates is, could the whole nomination come down to those superdelegates, and would they be effectively in a position to override the primary vote?
They absolutely could, Keith, especially when you think about in the Democratic primaries, the regular voting delegates are awarded by proportional representation. So essentially, as long as you have three candidates who are each taking maybe 30% max, 35, 40%, this thing just keeps going. And then as you pointed out, these superdelegates, they're supposed to sort of stay uncommitted, but every time you see a high-profile, say, governor or member of Congress endorse one candidate or another, that's a superdelegate, and those essentially could be the power brokers who decide this if this keeps going on.
So the nominee used to be chosen, used to be bargained for in the proverbial smoke-filled room, in the back room, at the conventions. Then came the rise of the era of the primaries and democracy in the primary process. And the superdelegates are there to make sure the party bosses can still decide who the nominee is, just like it was still 1912?
Or just like the 1960s, essentially what happened is in the early 1970s, the Democratic Party said, you know what, let's take the power out of the hand of, say, the Daley family and give it back to the grassroots activists. They did that, and a funny thing happened in 1972. The Democrats nominated George McGovern, an anti-Vietnam War liberal, who then got trounced in the general election. So the Democratic Party establishment figures said, wait a second, let's essentially add a safety valve here. Let's put some of the establishment figures back into this so in case our party voters do something radical, that we can pull them back. And essentially that's why the system has been in place ever since then.
So the idea of, as you suggested, that whenever we see a sort of name endorsement of one of the principles, there's nothing binding about that whatsoever. There's nothing binding about the superdelegate process whatsoever either?
Well, no, Keith, what happens is the superdelegates, you're talking about members of Congress, you're talking about governors, former presidents, President Clinton, Jimmy Carter, former Democratic vice presidents, so you're talking about Mondale and Gore, even members of the Democratic National Committee appointed by Howard Dean. Technically, they're neutral. They usually go with how their states go, but there's nothing controlling that. So, for example, if Barack Obama were to win New York State, even though Bill Clinton essentially lives in New York with his wife, he is still committed, of course, to Hillary Clinton. So there's really nothing forcing these superdelegates to go the direction that their state goes, and that's why these endorsements are so important, because the endorsements reflect the superdelegates. And again, it's a huge battle, not just for the publicity of the sake of these endorsements, but also because these superdelegates, as 40% of what you need to get the nomination, it can play a huge role, especially if this thing goes on for a while.
Makes you feel nostalgic for the smoke-filled room. David Schuster of MSNBC in South Carolina tonight. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Great. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Keith.